What if I told you that the expected rebirth of Lewis Hamilton in Ferrari could become a nightmare even greater than his last years in Mercedes? Can SF-25 updates really save their season? From the first second in which Lewis Hamilton presented himself with the iconic red Ferrari monkey, the expectation in the world of Formula One shot. It was not simply a change of equipment. It was a symbol. A movement that linked two giants, the most laureate pilot in modern history and the team with more tradition of motoring. It was sold as the perfect marriage. The heptacampion sought redemption after years of frustration in Mercedes, and Ferrari, the definitive resurgence after a decade of broken promises. But as usually happens in Formula One, Gloria's narrative can collapse quickly when the data does not support the illusion. In his debut in the Australian Grand Prix, Hamilton not only faced a new car, but a harsh reality. SF-25 was not what promised to be. The car presented structural deficiencies since the first weekend. Ferrari had worked in a theoretically balanced design, but on the asphalt of Albert Park, theory and practice collided. The car was unstable, nervous, difficult to place in curve, and extremely sensitive to height changes. The latter, a critical technical detail, condemns the car to erratic yields depending on the circuit and aerodynamic load conditions. Hamilton, meanwhile, tried to adapt. He is a pilot who has historically demonstrated the capacity to mold his style to the characteristics of the car. And he did. He adopted a technique closer to that of Leclerc, releasing the accelerator before and anticipating the braking to maximize the curve passage. Despite this, his effort was eclipsed by the lack of confidence that the car inspired. Each curve became a fight. Each classification sector, a roller mountain of micro-corrections behind the wheel. Under normal conditions, Hamilton could make a difference. But with an SF-25 that seemed to have his own life, nor was his experience enough to avoid being trapped in mediocrity. The most alarming was the de-synchronization between the simulator and the track. Ferrari acknowledged that the behavior of the SF-25 in virtual environment was not reflected on the track, a serious problem in a category where the equipment depends on the simulated data to plan every detail of the weekend. This technical disconnection implies that engineers prepare a configuration believing to have a solid base, only to discover in free practice that the car reacts completely differently. And on a compressed schedule for weekends, where there is only one practice before a sprint or classification, this type of errors compromise performance from the beginning. The Miami Grand Prix ended up confirming suspicions. In the slow section of curves 11 to 16, Ferrari's car behaved more like a rally vehicle than as an elite Formula One. Aggressive survival, loss of traction, lack of braking stability, all the symptoms of an aerodynamic concept that had not matured correctly. Hamilton, who had left Mercedes with the hope of a new beginning, was now in an ironically similar situation, with a car that does not allow you to compete from you against the best. This initial stage of the year has served, rather than to add points, as an assimilation process. Hamilton did not get to Ferrari thinking about rebuilding. He arrived to win. But reality has put it in front of a different challenge. Lead from within, the technical transformation of a defective machine. With each session, each batch is learning the limits of your car. However, the clock runs. And in Formula One, opportunities do not expect. Will Hamilton be able to find balance in a car that has so far proven to be his greatest enemy? And how long will be willing to try if the results do not arrive? The problem facing Lewis Hamilton is not simply limited to a car that is not competitive. It goes much further. At this point of the season, what Ferrari has put on the track not only prevents him from winning careers, but also prevents him from developing a solid technical base on which to build. And that is perhaps the biggest problem. When a top team like Ferrari publicly recognizes that its car does not behave the same in the simulator than on the track, what is at stake is not a tenth of a second. It is the complete credibility of the project. The SF-25 has become a walking laboratory. A car that does not respond to the classic setup, nor the aerodynamic simulations that are performed in Maranello. During the sessions in Miami, the technicians observed how both Hamilton and Leclerc had to fight around after return with a hyperreactive rear axle. It was not just a survival issue, but of deep tensile instability, especially at the exit of slow curves. This forces pilots to reduce their aggressiveness in acceleration, which compromises speed in the sections of greater demand. In practical terms, it is like running with an extra load that the rest of your rivals do not have. Hamilton has tried to compensate for these deficiencies with his experience. Minimum adjustments in the driving style, stop a little earlier, modify the entrance line to soften the transition of the car in the vertex. But when the car has such a narrow operation window, each change generates a domino effect that is reflected in other areas. Tire wear is triggered, the brake temperature becomes erratic, the aerodynamic balance is lost. And the most worrying, the data that engineers receive do not serve as a reliable guide for the following stint or the following race. From the structural point of view, the SF-25 is showing unbalanced design symptoms. The telemetric analysis carried out after the Miami career revealed that, in the first sector, Ferrari lost more than 0.4 of a second compared to the best. And not due to lack of power or pilot errors, but for an inability of the chassis to generate sufficient load in low-speed conditions. To this is added a second sector in which the red car was only the fastest ninth of the entire grille. This is dramatic for a team that is supposed to be competing with McLaren and Red Bull by victories. Internal conversations in Maranello reflect this urgency. The team has started an accelerated restructuring of the update program. But even here the signals are contradictory. Although it was initially leaked that Imola would be the place to introduce a revolutionary aerodynamic package, Fred Vasseur, the team leader, has had to clarify those expectations. The exact words were "a small step," followed by another in Barcelona, which indicates that, for now, there is no miraculous solution. There is no silver bullet. Only progressive adjustments that must be assembled as a puzzle. And meanwhile, the races continue to add and the points escaping. For Hamilton, this represents a technical and emotional dilemma. He knows that a season can be lost in the first 3 or 4 major awards. And he also knows that Ferrari, historically, has been a team where improvements are late or are inconsistent. His presence in the team was aimed at accelerating that culture of response, injecting elite demand and maximizing every opportunity. But with a car that does not even allow them to work in reliable career rhythm, that ambition is disarmed by the reality of development. The symptoms are clear. Loss of traction, very close operational window, failed correlation between simulator and track, and an aerodynamic concept that seems more experimental than competitive. The question that begins to emerge is whether Ferrari bet badly in the design of the SF-25 from the beginning. And if so, how long can it be lost before Hamilton begins to think about the real viability of this project? At this point of the season, the great unknown that surrounds Ferrari and Lewis Hamilton is not whether the car is competitive, because the evidence has already demonstrated otherwise. The real question is whether the team has the technical, structural, and human capacity to reverse the situation before it is too late. This is the border between legitimate hope and self-imposed illusion. And it is a line that, historically, Ferrari has crossed many times with devastating consequences. As Emilia-Romagna's Grand Prix is approaching in Imola, which is perceived from within and outside the team as a mixture of technical urgency and contained expectations. Imola should have been the turning point. In theory, it was the date chosen to launch a complete update package. Flat background, diffuser, changes in the rear suspension, and a partial redesign of the front wing. But reality ended up being more modest. Fred Vasseur made it clear, it will be a small step, a measured advance, not a revolution. And that in itself is a worrying message. Because although progressive evolution can work in teams with a solid base, for a car as misaligned as the SF-25, the small steps may not be enough. The next key date in the technical calendar is Barcelona. There is expected a second wave of improvements. The critical question is, will they have enough time and resources to redesign the foundations of the car in full season? Ferrari is not just facing McLaren and Red Bull on track. The most revealing thing was that Lewis Hamilton, after China's Grand Prix, there, for the first time since his arrival in Maranello, he showed a more connected version of himself with the car. His return in the sprint classification was one of the best of the year. Precise, aggressive, clean. But even that flash of hope was overshadowed by the feeling that SF-25 only behaves correctly in very specific conditions. In other words, it is not that the car has improved substantially, but that the conditions played in their favor for a brief moment. And that is what makes this phase of the season a psychological trap. Because in Formula One, the perception of progress can be as dangerous as its lack. A specific result can make up a poor technical structure. A good weekend can delay decisions that should be made urgently. And in this context, Ferrari runs the risk of believing that the worst has already happened, when in reality he could be just beginning. Hamilton, meanwhile, is dealing with a constant tension. It has little margin of error. He is aware that his arrival in Ferrari was sold as a master strategic movement. And any sign of stagnation not only threatens its reputation, but that of the project itself. His patience, although legendary in the difficult years with Mercedes, is not infinite. If the car does not respond to the improvements, if the balance does not improve, and if the results still do not reach, it will not be strange that internal tensions begin. And at that time, what is presented today as an explosive union between talent and team can be transformed into a deep fracture. The most disturbing thing is that while Ferrari seeks to stabilize his situation, his rivals are in full phase of consolidation. McLaren not only leads but does it with technical confidence, with an aggressive evolution of the car and a team that knows how to react to different scenarios. Red Bull, although he has lost some of his domain of previous years, still has Max Verstappen executing each career with clinical efficiency. In this context, any error, any delay, any update that does not work 100% means losing ground that is almost impossible to recover. So what do we have in front of us? An epic redemption story about to begin, or a repetition of the chronicle of a failure announced? Everything will depend on whether Ferrari, this time, is willing to abandon speeches and embrace the deep changes that are required to compete. Because Hamilton did not come to Ferrari to participate. He came to win. And what happens in the next two major awards could define whether this ambition becomes history or disappointment. This is not simply the outcome of one more story in Formula One. It is the prelude to something much bigger. Because what is at stake here is not just a season, not even the prestige of a historical team. What is defined in the coming months is the legacy of one of the greatest pilots of all time and the immediate future of Ferrari as a real force in the elite of motoring. And that, as you know well, is not measured at points, is measured in impact. How narratives change. How a campaign can transform the global perception of a team, a pilot, and an entire project. Lewis Hamilton has opted his reputation in this last stage of his career. After conquering everything conquered, he chose the most difficult challenge possible. Return Ferrari to the top. Not out of necessity but by conviction. For the desire to demonstrate that it can still be decisive. But the F1 does not reward intentions, it rewards executions. And for now, Ferrari has given him a defective tool. The question that floats in the air is if Hamilton can mold this car in his image as he did with Mercedes. Or if it will end up being absorbed by the same structural errors that have condemned so many other great talents who went through Maranello without glory. From the preseason tests to the Miami Grand Prix, the signals have been mixed. Moments of isolated brilliance, such as that classification return in China, are interspersed with races where the car seems to belong to another category. The disconnection between simulator and track has not been resolved. The promised improvements are not yet arrived. And meanwhile, the calendar advances mercilessly. Each race without forceful results approaches Ferrari to the same script ever, that of the wasted potential. But the story is not yet written. And that is what makes this moment one of the most intense in recent years. Imola will be a first exam. Barcelona the following. If the updates do not radically transform the car's behavior, the questions will begin to take strength not only within the paddock, but in the Ferrari offices and in Hamilton's mind. Was this the right decision? Is there real margin of improvement? Or have you stumbled again with an illusion wrapped in red? Now I ask you, are we facing the beginning of a historical redemption or in the face of confirmation that Ferrari, however legendary, is no longer up to the modern challenge? What do you think you really need to change for this project to work? Let it know in the comments and do not forget to subscribe, because what is coming this season could redefine the competitive map of the entire Formula One. Here nothing ends. This is where everything begins. Are you ready for what is coming?